And here we are. Good morning, everyone. Following the tackling dummy is kind of a tough act to follow, especially with data and privacy. So let's dive into the legal. I'm Jeff Coon. I'm a managing director at the firm, and I hope amongst the audience today, I'm the only person who's led the process of taking a company through an FTC investigation and penalization process. My scars are just getting healed up.
Hi, I'm Aditi Kumar. I'm the executive director at the Belfer Center, where I also run our economic diplomacy initiative.
Hey everyone, I'm Kevin Powers. I'm the founding director of the cybersecurity programs over at Boston College. We run a master's degree, we have a dual degree with the law school, and we run professional certificate programs. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. Hi, my name is Sonali Shah, and I'm Chief Product Officer at a cybersecurity company called White Ops. The reason why I'm wearing that t-shirt is because that is our tagline. We keep the internet human and protect it from automated bots.
Great. Thank you all for being here today. It's a very interesting time in our industry for data and privacy. Data is the new oil. Consumers are more terrified than ever about how their data is being collected, harvested, and utilized. We're facing a lot of very interesting times with things that have just happened in the past few weeks. Firefox just introduced an update which essentially eliminated third-party cookie tracking. What are the implications for audience targeting and measurement of our advertising campaigns? Google just introduced a proposal 2 weeks ago at an IAB event in San Francisco where they're beginning the discussion of the elimination of third-party cookie tracking in Chrome, which is the predominant browser used in the United States and most of our core markets today. And there's a very interesting set of trade-offs and consequences. Who wins with GDPR and privacy legislation? Are we giving consumers a win? Do they even understand that win? So why don't we start off, who has GDPR helped today, really? Aditi?
Sure, I can start. I think from a private sector perspective, obviously clarity is key. And at this point in the cycle when data privacy laws are definitely coming down the pipeline, I think it's best to have a national policy. It's best to get out and actually know what you're up against. And in the US especially, I think the goal should be to have a national policy so that companies are not facing 50 different compliance regimes. I do think, though, that there is still a great amount of uncertainty in how these laws are going to play out and who the winners and losers will be. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is there is this inherent trade-off that is emerging between consumer protection and privacy and some of what GDPR has tried to put forth and also the China cybersecurity law, some tensions between that and the artificial intelligence agenda and the fact that increasingly nation states are starting to view data as a national asset and developing a national artificial intelligence agenda. And so I think what we're going to see over the next few months and years is policymakers trying to resolve that conflict. Obviously, with data privacy rules, there are higher costs to developing AI, not only in the usual way of increasing compliance costs, but also there are practical limitations to AI development in the way that GDPR has envisioned how data can be used, the right to be forgotten, and other requirements like that. And so going forward, I think as nations try to figure out how to give themselves an advantage in the AI space, it might impact the way they then envision the data privacy laws that they're developing.
And that's a great point, and we definitely see real consequences of that today in many of our conversations where CFIUS considerations have significantly changed the M&A landscape and some of the dynamics quite substantially in just the past year and a half.
Right, and of course the mandate of CFIUS has evolved considerably since it was conceived in the 1970s, but even a few years ago, the idea was that CFIUS would step in to intervene when Chinese companies were investing in semiconductors and things like that. But what you're seeing now is that they actually stopped the acquisition of Grindr because of the PII that that company has on American citizens, that they've tried to stop the acquisition of companies in the biopharma industry. And so it's become more about data, and it's become more about data as an American asset and how you prevent that from getting into the hands of potential adversaries.
So Sonali, a question for you. Do you think companies are compliant with GDPR?
No.
No?
So
Wait, I mean, I heard a little laugh from the audience there.
Yeah, so I was reading, I don't remember the exact stat and where it came from, but there was a study looking at companies across Europe, and about 30% of them said they were almost GDPR compliant, right? So I think, to your earlier question, sort of who's benefited, it's been this sort of perverse reaction. So I think a lot of why laws like GDPR and the California privacy laws that'll be going into effect soon are meant to protect consumers from companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, some of these large social networks and retailers that have a lot of our information. I actually think in some way they're the ones that are benefiting because the cost of implementing GDPR properly and being fully compliant, not partially compliant, is really expensive, right? I mean, it's hard to know. So if a customer comes and says, okay, I want you now to remove my data, to put that system in place to know where their data even is and how to, get it out of all the other data you have and delete it, that's really expensive. And it's only the large companies that can really comply. So I think when I think of who's winning, I think some of the large tech companies, and you talked about Google and what they're coming out with potentially not having third-party cookies. They already have all the data. They don't even need the cookies, right? They've got their own Google ID. So I think they're benefiting. And then I think sort of it's harder for smaller companies now to compete. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have privacy restrictions, but that's just sort of one of the things that we've seen. Companies that have benefited are cybersecurity companies, right? There's a whole bunch of them. I'm sure there's some in the audience that have just popped out because VC funding is going through anything that is like, helping you become GDPR compliant. So they've certainly benefited. And I think I don't want to be too sarcastic. I think the consumers have benefited as well, just in terms of the increased awareness that's out there.
That's great. Kevin, you had some great remarks in our conversation earlier, and I would love to talk about how the word reasonable is about to become one of the most hotly debated definitions, far more than covfefe or anything else. So we had a great discussion. LabMD and that recent finding around a year ago, how do you think that translates into what we as an industry should be thinking about and focusing on in our plans for the next year or two?
Sure, but let me answer your first question on who's winning this and the GDPR, who's winning it. I'll tell you right now, it's the regulators and it's the plaintiff's attorneys. The companies right now might be in the lead as we're talking about, but the way things are going, it's going to be tough on you because it's a law that's hard to comply with, okay? The regulators are focused on coming after you to penalize you. And with all these other laws coming out, like with the California Consumer Privacy Act, other laws, the focus is going to be on you, and stand by and get ready and get a good attorney. Yeah. And I'm a good attorney. No, I'm only kidding. I'm a professor, but I know a few good ones.
You're graduating a lot of good attorneys.
Yeah, and it's a sad thing. But as to reasonableness, that goes to GDPR, which talks about appropriate. If you're not familiar, you look at the GDPR, you look at what the FTC does, and you look at the varying over 50 state laws. When they talk about best practices or standards, they talk about reasonableness, okay? They don't define what those are. They don't tell you. And in fact, the FTC, when queried on the NIST framework, which many of you are familiar with, they were queried, what's the best framework out there? Is the NIST framework, which you always push out, is that considered a best practice? FTC came back and said, yeah, it's kind of a best practice, but we don't believe there is a best practice. Just be reasonable. Okay, and then they don't define what reasonableness is. So when Jeff brought up the LabMD case, what recently happened there, over the past 10 years, FTC's been going in. They've been looking at varying breaches, and they come in and they settle the case through a consent order. And what they would do is no matter what you did, if it was a specific harm, they didn't focus on the specific harm. They talked about your overall plan and then said, this is what you need to do. And if you don't do this, we're going to come at you again and fine you accordingly. LabMD, that was one case that was fought by the company. Okay, so they went through the administrative district court, they went up to the commission. Commission found what they did was wrong and came out with one of these broad decisional orders. They fought it up to the 11th Circuit, which came back and said, listen, you didn't address the issue at hand. What happened was there was a peer-to-peer issue where one of the managers was sharing information that shouldn't have been shared. They had a policy that prevented that, so you just had a manager who was rogue. The court came back and said, how do you address this with this broad brush? That's not how it works. So go fix this order. And by doing so, that sent reasonableness up into craze, where many companies are now saying, are these consent orders worth the paper they're written on now? Can we contest those? My thought on that is, well, why bother? You're taking another legal case on. And a lot of those consent orders aren't thrown out the window. They actually give you a nice idea of what the FTC thinks is reasonable practices, because they've been telling you this is what you need to do to comply. Again, there's some structure there, but I don't think anyone in this room wants the regulator to come in and say, you have to do these 20 things, because then you're locked in a box, right? And those 20 things might be outdated in 2 to 3 years. So they're trying to work, I'll give the regulators some credit here. They're trying to work with you to give the elastic approach, but still, the biggest issue out there is you can be compliant, right, which is a baseline, but not secure, or you could be compliant and secure, but not be reasonable. And that's a problem for you. And I'm giving you the lawyer answer of, what does reasonableness mean? Well, it depends.
So the concrete answer is there is no concrete answer.
No, there really isn't right now, and it puts you in a tough position, because you're going to have your CISO, your chief security officer, they're working on what are these best practices, and they have different frameworks, and depending what regulator's looking at your issue, they're going to come out and determine whether you were doing things right or you weren't. So I apologize to give you the bad news, but that's where we're at.
If I could just jump in, I very much agree with you that there's this squishiness as to what is reasonable and what does privacy mean and what does security mean. And what makes it even more challenging, I think, is technology is changing so quickly. So that what is reasonable, like for this particular audience, when you're talking about ad tech, what is PII when it comes to your mobile device versus your CTV device versus your desktop, right? What is PII in all of these? Right. And then how do you protect it? Now, the way you protect data, if you look at cybersecurity trends, there's new technologies emerging all the time. And I'll give you an example of the WAF, which is the Web Application Firewall, which is considered for HIPAA, which is for the health industry keeping their data private, that is considered reasonable practice. If you have a WAF, if you have Web Application Firewall, you've met certain HIPAA guidelines. The WAF doesn't help anyone, right? And it's become such an old technology that it's become very easy for hackers to go around it. So the technology has moved ahead, but HIPAA has not changed. So even if we did have a definition of what is reasonable, it's going to keep on changing. And that's one of the great things about technologies is always changing, but that always makes it hard as well.
I think the one thing I would add to that is there is a multinational challenge there too, because in many ways, I don't know how this regulatory infrastructure should shape up, and I don't think any of us do. I worked in the finance industry when Dodd-Frank was shaping up, and that was a similarly challenging concern where you have a fast evolving business model and you understand the regulations as you implement them, and with each year they become a little bit more specific and a little bit less stringent, and I wonder if we're heading down that road here too. But it seems to me important that we do that in the United States as opposed to just following the example of the Europeans or the Chinese, because we have companies operating in a multinational theater, and so when we kind of abdicate the data privacy space and let other nation states fill them with their domestic laws and have our companies responding to those instead of our own, it seems to me that is not an optimal solution. That's something to put out there for.
Yeah, and on that point too, we have all these laws out there now. You could be compliant with GDPR and then not compliant with the California law. Sure. You're going to have like conflicts in the law. So as a company, if you're global, what you're doing, it's like what jurisdiction are you working in? It's almost forcing your company now to set up shops throughout the world and then keep data there as opposed to spreading it around and securing it in the cloud. It's a tough
That's a great point. And just in the United States alone, we face California CPA comes into effect January 1st. I believe it's 8 states now have read CPA and essentially proposed comparable legislation with slight edits and modifications, there's also been a push backed by certain very large technology companies to implement legislation at the federal level that consolidates and makes consistent some form of, obviously the preference being a less stringent set of guidelines. How do you think that shakes out? And what are the implications for us?
Yeah.
Can I jump?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so on that, I know the Brookings Institute is looking at that and working on that right now. And that, what he's talking about is a broad federal law. So you have all these notification requirements and standards for privacy. What we're looking at right now, and okay, so we're going to have Congress act on that, so good luck with that. But what it would be is a national standard on saying, here's what privacy is, here's what your rights are. It's similar to the GDPR in many, here's the notification requirements, and here's the practices you should follow, and that could be reasonable. The key to all of this is that it has to preempt all state laws, meaning that the states can't come out and say what privacy is. It's now a federal issue. Right now, the debate is it going to be watered down? Because you have companies like, no, like keep it low. Or you're going to have the privacy advocates win on this one where it turns into GDPR. The way it probably will work, if it ever gets done, I think it would be more like a GDPR, because the GDPR is already here. 95% of the companies, if not all companies, are impacted by the GDPR. So why change it and just like make it leveled? The key is, do they preempt the state laws? And if they are, they're going to have to make it really a tough law. If it's not going to preempt, and we're still in the same pickle.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think if you have the cost of doing business in multiple states really increases when you've got regulations that are different for each state. So it's just not sustainable. I do think a lot of companies are already almost GDPR compliant or trying to become GDPR compliant, so that just by default almost becomes sort of the easiest thing to do. But I want to look even broader, right? So we're looking at US and Europe. Well, then you go, into Asia, you go into, I won't name the name, there's a particular global organization that is investing in fintech and fintech that is especially doing social good, right? In India. And they were concerned about investing in a company because they didn't have the right privacy policies in place. And my thought was, you're giving people something for free that they couldn't afford. And privacy, yes, they should know what's happening with their data, but privacy means something different there. So I think we also have to be aware of economic differences, cultural norms, and what privacy means and the value of it across the world. Like that, for multinationals, I think that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think it's important, though, to achieve some level of standardization across the different regulatory regimes. The problem is, so with GDPR, I think the regulation does allow data to go out of the EU, except if the corresponding country doesn't have an equally stringent data requirement. So that's something that we could work with the Europeans, right? And you could see a US-EU relationship where data continues to flow in the same way that it has in the past. With China, I think the challenge is a little bit more difficult because their data outflow is tied to broadly national security concerns. And so if they have a regime where the government can clamp down on data transfer, because not just because of privacy, not just because of similar regulatory regimes, but because of some broadly and ill-defined, deliberately national security concerns, I think that creates a balkanization in the tech industry and in the way that the internet works that could be vastly damaging to our tech ecosystem. So I think that there is some work to be done at the international level to reach those agreements, and some of that needs to be done at the multilateral agency level. Some of the institutions that have existed in the past to regulate trades in goods and services are not equipped to handle data transfer. And so what are the mechanisms, aside from trade wars and things like that, which we could continue to engage in, but what are actually productive mechanisms by which we solve some of these problems in the long term?
So on that vein, but slightly different, it feels like our industry has failed to educate the consumers that we provide all these wonderful apps and services and websites and content, and the value exchange is we serve advertising and we monetize your eyeballs in exchange for you enjoying our services and enjoying our content. What can we as an industry do to transform that messaging and positioning and better elaborate on that value exchange?
I think, and my thought is always on this, like no matter what, efficiency is going to trump privacy, right? You know, if I can order a pizza online, I'm going to give out my name and give out my credit card. I don't care. I'm going to get the pizza at my house and watch the Patriots, okay? So I think for the advertising side, it's just upfront and honest. You know, hey, if you give us this information, you know, this is what we're going to use it for, and then give them the opportunity to whether opt in or opt out. And I think consumers, if they're going to get what you're going to, you know, they want that service, they're going to do it. It's just more upfront information. Because right now, honestly, the people concerned about privacy is us, because that's what we do, and then you, because it has a consequence. But I don't think the majority of Americans are really concerned about that. They want to jump online and do their thing.
Well, I think it's a great question.
Yeah.
The Cambridge Analytica scandal, the massive collection of data and exploitation of that data very effectively for political targeting. Aside from a $5 billion penalty, have there been any other really visible consequences for Facebook from that ordeal?
No, and I would argue even the same with data breaches for, when you look at Target, they got breached, right? Like all these big, MasterCard, tons of companies have been breached. There is like zero impact on their market cap. There may be a dip for a day, and then whoever has been shopping at Target all their life will continue to shop at Target. So I do think that it's also up to the consumer, right? You were saying like, what can we as an industry do? Yes, absolutely. There's a lot we can do to educate, but consumers also have to step up. And by the way, we are consumers, right? So if my kids are screaming and they're hungry and I just have to give away my information to get that pizza, I will do it. So we individually have to step up as consumers. And you know, you were saying, well, people don't quite understand the value exchange, right? We're giving data, you're getting good information. I don't know that I agree with that. I think everybody knows. When you get something for free, you're giving up something, right? There's nothing for free.
Nothing's free.
Nothing's free. And so it's, I think consumers have to do more themselves. You know, I knew I was attending this panel, so I was at a dinner party last weekend, and I was asking people, these are all well-educated people, about privacy, and everybody's like up in arms, yes, they shouldn't be using our data in a bad way. But then I said, well, you know all these pop-ups that have been coming up, are you reading them? No, they're just clicking away.
But I think that's a problem, right? Like I do think consumers care, and if you look at the polling, people care about privacy. The evidence is in the behavior, but it's kind of an unfair system where if you have a Capital One account and there's a data breach, you're asking people to vote with their feet, because right now they can't vote with their feet, right? Market power on the other side is so large that even though I know vaguely that maybe Equifax had a data breach and maybe Capital One had compromised my credit card information, I'm not exactly going to go over to Chase and move over my bank account, because that is inherently difficult. And so I wonder, once these laws do go into place, once we simplify those terms, when people can actually understand them, when we give them that very easy to understand big checkbox that says, are you okay with your data being transferred to a third party for not the purposes of what this website is doing, but for some other thing that you may not be aware of, I do wonder how customers will respond to that, and if you do give them more power to actually vote with their feet, if they will. So I think that's one of the things that remains to be seen as these laws go into effect.
Yeah, that's a great point too, because it should be simple, right? It's completely complex. You can't understand any privacy notice, right? But you should be able to click, 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 and you might see people saying, no, you can't use my privacy. And then there's the talk of the next step of like, well, if we give you another incentive, can you sell your privacy? I don't know where that's going to go. I don't know policy-wise if I agree with that.
Right.
But I don't think the government's going to let that happen.
I've seen several companies try that compensate me for my data model, and I've seen that model enough times, and I've seen that model pivot to something completely different enough times that I think the reality is, when faced with a question, customers will either choose to take the service as it stands or not use the service. Right. But you watch those companies that have become, tried that and became an ad blocker, tried that and became an analytics service, tried that and became something else entirely. It's a great question. I will say we're wrapping it up. Thank you very much, Aditi, Kevin, and Sonali. I think that was a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.